Before we get started, I wanted to give you a very quick announcement about an event that's taking place on Thursday this week at noon. We've got Ronell Anderson-Jones coming in from the law school at the University of Utah, talking about the chilling effects on press freedom by the recent spate of defamation suits. So I encourage you to come to that. But without any further ado, let me get on with a quick introduction here. I am very pleased to introduce Nick Brown, who is a graduate of Harvard Law School and a former Army JAG Corps lawyer, in addition to being a Bronze Star recipient. He served as lead counsel for Governor Jay Inslee, and then as U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Washington under President Biden. He won election to his current position in the 2024 election, and he is Washington State's 19th Attorney General. And something I found out today, which is that there have only been 6 Attorneys Generals since 1969. So, it's quite a good survival rate, which does bring me to that little factoid, which is, of course, that our Attorney General here was, in fact, a contestant on Survivor, the Australian Outback in 2001. Please join me in welcoming Attorney General Nick Brown.
Good afternoon. Thank you. When I did Survivor in 2001, when we filmed it, I never envisioned that however many years later that it would still be part of my story and my biography. But no matter where I go, it comes up every single time, which is perfectly okay. People have to understand, when I went on Survivor, there was no really such thing as reality television up until Survivor. And I don't think any of us knew what it might do or how it might last in the public culture, let alone for the people who played on the show. But thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry I'm running late today, but it is a pleasure to be here. And I understood that my predecessor had been here a number of times, although I didn't know as many times as you were noting. And I see my former client on the wall right behind me as well, and he certainly looms large in my professional life. But what I wanted to do is just share a little bit about the work of the Attorney General's office, a little bit about my own story, and talk to you about the things that our office is engaging in. And I also welcome the opportunity to answer questions from all of you about issues that you might be thinking about. But I've been the Attorney General for 34 days. It has not been a slow start to being the Attorney General of the state of Washington. But I have so much pride in being in this position, and to be the 19th Attorney General of this state where I grew up. And many, many years ago, at the very beginning of my sort of professional career, after I graduated college, before I went into law school, I was an intern in the AG's office with then Attorney General Gregoire, before she moved on to become governor. And I remember watching her talk about the work of the office. And this was in the wake of the tobacco litigation that Washington State was leading for the entire country, leading on an issue of immense public health importance, a case that is still going on to this day, a case that I actually just had to give my team some direction on. But I remember watching her talk about the work that the team was doing across the state. And it was the first time I ever thought about potentially being or working in the AG's office, let alone being the AG. And to go from being the intern to being the Attorney General and recognizing the immense work that we do and the importance of that work is a little bit surreal. And I'm really, really proud to be in this position. And I'll start with just talking about how incredibly important this office is to the state of Washington. We have one of the largest Attorney General's offices in the country. We have just over 830 lawyers that work for the AG's office. To give that some context, the state of New York has about 900 lawyers, a state that is much bigger with more people. But we do so much work across the state, the work that gets the headlines, which I'll talk about, but the day-to-day work that we do on behalf of all of our clients has a real profound impact on all of you in ways that you might see and in many ways that you don't. So we are this exclusive legal representation for all of state government. So every single state agency, whether it be the Department of Transportation or the Department of Licensing, all the way down to the very smallest boards and commissions. They all have lawyers that work for the state of Washington. And all those people are employees of the Attorney General's office. And we serve those clients trying to make sure that they are providing the best possible legal advice for the state of Washington. And so when you're thinking about all the ways that your life might interface with state government, behind the scenes are a bunch of lawyers trying to help them best serve all of you. And I'm really proud to have such a dedicated and strong team of experts, both professional staff and lawyers that are doing that work. But we also are the lawyers for the people of the state of Washington. And I very much think that that is why, or at least part of the reason, that we have a separately elected Attorney General in this state. Not every state has a separately elected Attorney General. Some are appointed by the governor. In one state, the Attorney General is selected by the state legislature. But in Washington, like many places, we are elected by the people to be your representative on many, many cases. And we show up across the board on issues impacting civil rights, environmental enforcement, consumer protection, antitrust, to be the advocate for the people. And so when we see the state of Washington's rights being violated or organizations having their rights implicated, we get to choose how to engage with whomever, opposing or supporting the rights of the people of the state of Washington. And to make those decisions, to know that every single charging decision in the state of Washington for the AG's office has my signature on it. It is a responsibility I take with a great deal of seriousness, because I know that every time that I show up on your behalf, I'm speaking as much as I can for the entire state, knowing that under the best of circumstances, I'm maybe making 55% of the state happy in the decisions that we're making, such is the joy of being a public official. And I will tell you, over the last month being in office, I have been flooded with both thanks and appreciation. A lot of people send handwritten letters to the AG's office thanking us for our engagement in various work. And then I get fairly consistent personal messages, either via email or in social media, direct messages, people who are upset and angry and frustrated. Some of people express that with sort of normal human decency. Many do not. Many express it with racism, bigotry, hatred, behavior that I would expect from my children. And but it is both the responsibility and the obligation of the AG to be responsive to the people. And so it is good to know that people are paying attention to the work that we're doing. But I did not envision that when I became the Attorney General that I would spend so much of my time in the first month in litigation against the President of the United States. And in fact, I wish I was not. It is not why I ran for Attorney General. I had a lot of ideas about the types of things that I would like to focus on, and we are heavily engaged in that work as well. But the work that shows up most in the public, in the newspapers and stories, is the work that we're doing against the Trump administration. So let me just talk a little bit about that, because I know it is top of mind for so many people. So I got sworn in on January 15th. The president got sworn in on January 20th. And since that time, we have been engaged on an almost daily basis, thinking about all of the ways that we could protect Washingtonians' rights. I want to highlight the woman that just walked in the back, because she is my chief legal deputy. Hi, Laura. And so Laura and I, many others, over the last month, spent a lot of time figuring out when and how we should show up to defend the rights of Washington. And thus far, we are involved in 5 different cases. The very first case that we decided to file was challenging the president's executive order around birthright citizenship. This is a case that many people are familiar with, but there are actually 2 separate cases that are happening, brought by attorney generals in the country. One led by Washington State, along with 3 other states, where we filed in the Western District of Washington, opposing the president's order, and another brought by my colleagues, led by New Jersey, but filed in the District of Massachusetts, that is joined by 18 other attorney generals. And what we decided to do is what I decided to do in every single case when we're thinking about the challenges to the president. And it's really a fairly simple analysis. One, is this action illegal or unconstitutional? There are going to be many things that this president does that I don't like. And there were probably things that the last president did that I also didn't like. But as the Attorney General now, we first look to see, is this action illegal or unconstitutional? Because there will be a myriad of policy changes, proposals, executive orders that are perfectly within the president's responsibility and perfectly within his authority. But the first analysis is to say, is this illegal? The second is to say, does this negatively impact Washington or Washington organizations? Because there will be many things that the president does that may not impact state of Washington, or at least not to the degree where we think litigation is appropriate. There are a lot of things that the president has done where it is more appropriate for individual parties or nonprofits or private institutions to bring challenges against the president. We've seen that most recently in a response to the president's orders around attacking and eliminating DEI. The state of Washington and no other state brought a case, but private parties did, and private individuals did, private organizations did. But I always look to, one, is it illegal or unconstitutional? Two, does it impact Washingtonians? And three, is it appropriate for Washington to be involved in a case and lead a case or to be a part of the litigation? There are many, many cases where it might be illegal, it might impact Washington, but another party, another state is the appropriate lead in that state. A good example for that for us is we challenged 2 executive orders by the president challenging his various cuts to funding. One was the overall funding freeze that he tried to put in place, and another one was the funding freezes around the National Institute of Health grants, which really had an impact on Washington State University, actually. Both of those cases, we are parties as the state of Washington to those cases, but they are brought in other cases in other districts, in the District of Rhode Island and the District of Massachusetts. And that was done in collaboration with all of the other Democratic attorney generals to figure out what is the right venue for these cases, where do we have the most likelihood for success, not only at the district court level, but the appellate court level, to make sure that we are advancing the rights of Washingtonians with the best likelihood of success. And so that is why in those particular cases that we just showed up in that fashion. And we're also involved in 2 other cases. One is a case against Doge. You may have heard of Doge. In fact, I was telling some of our divisions earlier today, complaints to the AG's office, the number 1 complaint that we get by exponential factors is around Doge. And that is true not only for our AG's office, but for every AG's office in the country. It is the number 1 thing that people, constituents, are reaching out to the AG's office with concerns about, either via email or calls. People rightly very concerned about their privacy, their personal information, their financial information, their healthcare information being subject to Elon Musk, who does not really have an official role in government, certainly has not been nominated for a position that would require Senate confirmation, and is being staffed by largely people without any sort of security clearance, unlike the rest of government. And that is the number 1 case that we are fielding questions about. But we joined a case against Doge, directly naming not only the president, but Elon Musk. And that is a case led by the District of New Mexico, along with Arizona and Michigan. We did not join the very first case against Doge, which was a more narrow challenge to his work in the Treasury Department, but we challenged his ability under the Appropriations Clause, which essentially says that the president has to nominate and have Senate confirmation for people that are acting as a certain level of executive officer, which clearly has not happened in this case. So we brought that case. We actually were unsuccessful in bringing a request for a temporary restraining order. The judge essentially said, you have a really good case, but maybe not quite the immediate emergency such that a need for a TRO is required. So that case will continue to proceed. And then 2 weeks ago, we brought a case challenging the president's executive order around transgender healthcare. And Washington led that case with 2 other states. No other AGs have decided to bring a similar case. But essentially what we said is that the president cannot illegally withhold funding from healthcare institutions providing healthcare to their patients. The University of Washington has been a national leader in this work. There are many facilities across the state of Washington that have been national leaders in this work. And the president essentially cut off funding without going through all the normal channels to do so. But on top of the funding cuts, he also threatened jail, prison, for people providing this care, both for doctors and parents who were allowing their children to receive this care. And that threat from the federal government is pretty profound. And I don't want to move past that too quickly, because it is not normal for the president to threaten jail against doctors under any circumstance. It is not normal for a president to threaten jail against parents who are providing health care for their children. And we should not accept that as normal. At least I do not accept that as normal. And on many things, and on this particular case, I think reasonable people can have reasonable policy differences about whether we should fund NIH grants at the level that we do, whether federal government is too big, whether we should change how we provide for citizenship in America, whether we should provide that type of healthcare to anyone or minors in particular. And I do think reasonable people can reach reasonable disagreements about that. But the manner by which we make those decisions is not by executive fiat. In this country, we have a process to amend the Constitution to provide for citizenship. We have a process by which Congress authorizes funding for programs across the United States. And in the NIH case in particular, almost all of those funding streams approved by Congress had a provision that specifically said you cannot do what the president did. And so I know a lot of people think government is too big, it's too bloated, DOE should come in and clean up and eliminate waste and fraud, et cetera. Query whether they're doing any of that. But if they're going to do that, there is a process by which Congress has provided for those changes to occur. And I do not think we should simply accept that the president gets to do it because he won the election, because that is not the way I view our democracy as working. And that is why Washington has continued to show up in these spaces, and we will continue to show up challenging the president or any other actor that I believe is harming Washingtonians. But even outside of what we do against the president of the United States, Laura's team and our team across the state of Washington, we continue to be advocates for the people against anyone that will harm Washingtonians' interests. And that manifests in so many different ways, against companies that are doing misleading business practices. We're spending a lot of time these days thinking about the housing crisis that we're facing in this state, in large part, I think, driven by the nationalization in the housing market, which allows for companies to take advantage of renters and buyers alike. We are doing everything we can to address anti-competitive behaviors when we see mergers that are reducing competition, often leading to loss of jobs and increased prices for Washingtonians, which is why this office led opposing the merger of Kroger and Albertsons last year. We continue to show up in so many different areas, going after people that pollute and harm our environment, and often do so intentionally. And that work is so important for Washingtonians' interests, at least in my viewpoint. And so as long as I'm Attorney General, we will continue to advocate hard for your rights and your protections. And if it is illegal, if it harms Washingtonians, and if Washington is the right place to do that work, we will continue to show up through our litigative work. And it is so much fun being Attorney General. As much as I worry about our public discourse, as I worry about how people decide to voice their displeasure with me personally or the office, as we continue to debate issues of vitally important issues. And all of the issues that I've talked about and so many more are really vitally important. But I just hope we can continue to have that debate and dialogue in a serious way and respectful of each other. And I will endeavor to be that type of person as long as I'm an Attorney General. Let me stop there. I would love to answer your questions. Now, this is a much more active audience than my last one. Go ahead, sir.
When you talk about the transgender, like what do you mean by that? Are you talking about like the change in sex surgeries?
It's part of it. So reproductive health care or gender affirming care is not limited to people who are interested in transitioning. It's also can be for cisgender people as well. And the president's executive order was not limited, in fact, in its words. Make sense?
Yeah, because I mean the transgender surgeries. I'm sorry, I don't really support those. I think that there's only two genders. You were born a man or a woman.
Yep.
So I fully support Trump in that. I am, you know, that's something that Washington State does, I think needs to stop, is we need to stop providing transgender surgeries because of that. And personally, I don't want my or anybody's tax dollars going for that. You know,
And although I disagree, strongly disagree, I think there are important ways to have that debate and that conversation. In Washington, it is legal. And as the Attorney General of Washington State, it is my responsibility and indeed, I think my oath to defend Washington State law. And so part of my point on that issue, on many other issues, is if the president wanted to change that, or if Congress wanted to change it, there is a process by which those laws are changed, and not through the threats of prison that the president took. But I think reasonable people can disagree about it.
I'm fielding questions from the online chat.
I didn't know there was an online chat.
There are cameras. The first question is, what is Washington prepared to do in the event that the Trump administration ignores a court order?
Well, let me say a couple things to whoever is looking online. What I would say first is, like, thus far, the process is going the way it should. The president has taken actions. We have challenged those actions. Courts have issued orders. In 4 of the 5 cases that we filed, the court has issued both a temporary restraining order and then a preliminary injunction. I would anticipate in the Doge lawsuit some affirmative relief for Washington and the other states. And thus far, the administration is largely abiding by those. We had some hiccups in the funding cases where the judge ordered a fairly sweeping order to essentially turn the money back on, and it wasn't being followed to a T. We filed a motion to enforce, which is akin to a motion for contempt, and they changed their behavior. So thus far, it's working the right way, and we will take it one day at a time. The fact that we're even contemplating that we might be in a position where the president or the administration does not follow court orders, in my mind, says so much about the type of president that we have. It would be so, I oftentimes think if the parties were different and if Obama or Biden were doing certain things, what Republicans would say. And there's hypocrisy on both sides of the aisle sometimes, but never in a million years would you have had President Biden say, well, I'm the king. There is no law except for what I say, essentially, or the vice president of the United States saying, essentially we should impeach judges. And it's profoundly disturbing. And I don't want to move past that. But right now, we're taking it one step at a time. And then the other thing I'll say is, it would be one thing for the president to ignore an order. And I think there are real questions about what could a state do or a court do against the president. But in almost every case that we've brought, we've sued not only the president, but the head of the agencies. And agency heads may not be as bold as the president. And they might feel a little bit more personal liability if a judge saying, I'm going to hold you, John Smith, agency director, in contempt, fines, jails, etc. But part of my job is to act very seriously and not shout fire where there's not a fire yet. And so right now there's not a fire. There might be a little smoke, but there's no fire.
Hi, my name's Carla. I'm on Pullman City Council. Thanks for coming to Pullman.
Thank you for your work.
I also, thanks. I wrote my question just to make sure that I got it right. So I know that cities have passed resolutions reaffirming the sanctuary status of Washington, such as Seattle, Olympia, more recently Spokane. So what are your thoughts around other cities passing these resolutions that reaffirm state law? And is there any general advice or insight on the benefits or risks cities may take on by doing this?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question because probably maybe second to Doge, the number one issue that we are being responsive to is around immigration-related issues. First, I don't sanctuary state or sanctuary laws is not something that's defined in state law, and so I am very reticent to say we are a sanctuary state or not. Like, we have the Keep Washington Working Act, which provides clarity to local jurisdictions about how and when they can engage with federal immigration authorities, reaffirming that that is a federal function and not a state function. It is a law that is legal. It's on the books. I think it will withstand constitutional scrutiny by any federal court. It has certain policies for 6 different sectors across the state for law enforcement, healthcare, education, and a few others. I helped write those model policies many years ago. And so I continue to be an advocate and will defend the Keep Washington Working Act because it's good policy and it's part of Washington state law. Every local jurisdiction is going to have to take their own stance or perspective on that. Are local jurisdictions at risk? A little bit. We've seen in just the last couple weeks, the administration filed a lawsuit against the city of Chicago, Cook County, Illinois, and Illinois State. The New York City, the New York Attorney General directly, and the state of New York challenging their version of the sanctuary state law. I think Washington's law at some point is a fairly high likelihood to be subject to some sort of litigation. Local jurisdictions might have that same risk. And I don't know, every jurisdiction has a slightly different, and there's a difference between a law and a resolution. Resolutions are value statements more than anything else. I think it is really important for local jurisdictions to show up for their residents, and we serve all people in the state regardless of their status. And you have rights regardless of whether you're a citizen or non-citizen. The rights differ, but you still have rights to due process and the like. Washington has been a national leader, not just simply since the Trump administration or the first Trump administration, but for decades we have been a leader of being a welcoming state for immigrant populations, refugees. Governor Evans was the leader in welcoming Vietnamese refugees after the war at a time where most other states were not doing that work. We, of course, led the opposition to the Trump travel ban in 2017, and we will continue, as long as I'm Attorney General, to be a leader in that space. And I think it's important, and it's under attack. Yes.
So you mentioned the transgender, Washington State being one of the leaders against the Trump administration initiative with the ban on doctors, going after doctors providing gender affirming care. With Seattle Children's being one of the main hubs for children needing to receive gender affirming care in the state, I was just wondering what your opinion was on Washington being one of the only if I'm remembering what you said correctly, you're one of the only attorney general, like no other attorney generals have gotten in on this case yet, correct?
There are 4 now.
There are 4. Can I ask which states those are?
Oregon, Minnesota were both in our original case.
Okay.
And then Colorado joined when we amended the complaint last week.
Okay. Do you believe that more attorney generals will join in on this case, or do you think this is more of a Washington-led fight?
I will never speak for my other attorney generals. I would be surprised if more states did not join at some point. Every state is a little bit different. We led on it in part because it wasn't just a value statement, but because the University of Washington, for example, does a lot of research and funding in this work. Seattle Children's is a national leader. Seattle Children's had stopped doing gender affirming care because of threat of prosecution. The day we won our TRO, they sent messages out to a few dozen patients saying your appointments are rescheduled. So that immediate direct impact. Not every state has that same fact pattern on the ground. Oregon decided to join in part because Oregon State University is similar to UW in their work, but not every state has the same perspective. And look, this is as we've seen, this is a hotly debated issue, right? And that's fine. In some states, AGs didn't want to have that debate. And I think it's important for me and our office to show up where other states may not. Let me go over this side. Sir.
You said you don't communicate with other attorney generals in whatever situation you were talking about, but are there going to be cases of executive order opposition where a large number of attorney generals could come together to oppose these orders, such as the privacy issue. Wouldn't you expect that the majority of attorney generals would have the same views on that?
Well, and I'm sorry if I misspoke. So in most of the cases that we're involved in, there are multiple states. The NIH funding case and the case challenging the OMB funding freeze, 22 states joined both of those cases.
By party, right?
By party. I mean,
is it ever going to cross over?
I hope so. I mean, look, the funding freezes, for example, the states that they hit the most are super conservative Republican-led states. You know, Alabama is, I think, the most federally dependent state in the country. I would expect the AG there or the governor there to want to stand up to defend, you know, but we're not seeing any opposition to much of what President Trump is doing from Republicans in Congress or at the local level. Now, part of that is not unusual, right? Democrats are loath to sue the Biden administration, but we did it in the last administration. You know, to A.G. Ferguson's credit, he sued the Biden administration to assure that mifepristone, abortion medication, was legal and provided here at a time where most other states did not want him to do that. So I would hope that would be more bipartisan. You know, when we brought those cases, like it was limited to the cases, to the states in those cases, not the OMB, but the NIH funding case. So the only states that benefited from that order, at least on the law, were all the Democratic states, even though Republican states were hit hardest. And it's not only the funding, it's the jobs associated with it. There are some things where there's more bipartisan conversation. I went to the conference of the National Conference of Attorney Generals, which is a bipartisan group, before I became the AG, and there was a lot of bipartisan conversation around the work of the tech industry and protections for kids or in social media, and there's some uniform agreement around protections there. There's some uniform agreement around addressing the fentanyl crisis in the states. But when it comes to litigation, it is fairly rare, at least on the high profile stuff, for there to be bipartisan agreement. Sir.
Could you just talk about the Supreme Court and how it
I have to.
how it factors into your office's both calculations, and I'm glad to have you do some predictions as to how they're going to respond to this.
Let me say all the ways I'm going to be wrong in the future. Our Supreme Court is full of very smart, very talented jurists, legitimately. They have gotten much more, not only ideologically conservative, but also much more willing to, I think, allow their perspectives to disregard precedent and the like. I mean, obviously, the Dobbs decision is probably the most clear example of that. I also have tremendous concerns about not the legal decisions, but the ethics around it. I mean, Justice Thomas. I don't doubt the man's intellect, his commitment to this country or anything like that, but like the ethics, like as the former U.S. attorney, like I had to report if I got a free lunch, right? Let alone a free trip on a jet or free, you know. And the fact that the judiciary as a whole, but in particular the Supreme Court, seems to not care about basic government ethics is frustrating for me as a government employee. I won't predict how they'll handle these cases. What I would say is that I feel very confident that the birthright citizenship case, no matter where it goes, will be validated. The rest of these cases, I don't know. But to the extent it factors in, you know, you need to be thoughtful and prudent about how you bring cases, the arguments you make. But I don't think we should never not bring a case because we think we might lose. Like, let's fight the good fight. Let's do what's right for Washingtonians. And the work that we've done has an immediate impact. the funding stops, even if the Supreme Court may ultimately side with the president on these issues. In the meantime, Wazoo is getting hundreds of millions of dollars because Washington and other states showed up to oppose the funding cuts, like literally hundreds of millions of dollars between Washington State, UW, and other institutions. So in the meantime, I think that's really important. Ma'am.
I was wondering, in the past couple of weeks, there's been several mass layoffs of a lot of federal employees, including the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service. Here in Washington, we have a lot of wilderness land with a lot of recreators, and I was curious of the aid and support, if any, you were planning to provide for our wilderness and those who manage it.
I think, and unfortunately, we're fairly limited in what we could do to support that. I mean, we're not a funding agency, although the AG's office is the only revenue generating in the state of Washington. Like, we make money for the people of the state of Washington because we sue bad actors, many of whom have really deep pockets. But we provide a lot of guidance, legal support to our client agencies that interface. So DNR, Natural Resources, the forestry work on the state side, Department of Ecology, which touches some of those issues, which Laura used to lead. All of those clients are going to be impacted by this work and have turned to us for legal guidance. But for the most part, I mean, the president can fire federal employees. There are some that have civil service protections. Most of them have civil service protections. But the president rightly is given a great deal of authority to do those things. And, this is that index of mess around and find out, right? This is what's happening. But it's going to have real impact. And, we will probably have worse wildfires because of this, let alone all the other things, I think. Sir.
Thank you for being here today. We've talked a lot about some of our federal issues, but I had a more Washington-centered issue. Our budget has been projected to be between $15 and $20 billion in deficit. How has that affected your office so far? And if you don't mind me asking a second question, how do you think that's going to lay out for our foreseeable future as a state?
Well, I don't think it'll be that big of a deficit. I think it's likely around the 10 to 12 billion. But we're still talking B's, right? Big numbers. In the short term, it limits our ability to do anything new or creative. We have hiring vacancies across the agency that I'm not going to be able to fill. We're not traveling for trainings or conferences or some of the discretionary things. My predecessor, the current governor, is talking about cutting some of my budget, so we're having fun conversations around that. The money that is most at risk is the money that does the work that most directly impacts people. So we have about almost $70 million operating budget around all of our affirmative litigation. So civil rights, environmental protections, consumer protections, antitrust. The current governor has proposed taking more than half of that money, which would mean less cases. I'm hoping the legislature does not do that. But that's the type of things that's at risk in this budget. I mean, at the end of the day, budgets are value statements in addition to reflecting just the sheer needs of Washingtonians. There are many things that are baked into our budget, right? We have to pay for the care and custody of people in our state prisons. We have to pay for the care and custody of youth in our foster system. We have to care for the people in our various mental health institutions across the state. Like, we don't have a choice, it's not discretionary. There's a lot of discretionary spending in the state budget. And so the legislature is grappling with a really tough balance of where do we cut or where do we raise revenue? And raising revenue, nobody wants to pay more taxes. Everybody wants, there was a survey that came out about 18 months ago that said in Washington, the majority of the population, like 70%, wanted state government to spend more on social services and also wanted them to lower taxes. Guess what? You don't get both. It's not Christmas in America every day. But those are really tough decisions. And also, we forget about things that don't personally impact us as much, right? I don't have any family members in the foster care system, but we have tens of thousands of children in our foster care system. And we need to be thinking about people outside of our own small universes as well. And so I'm not a budget writer, which is being an executive is fun. Being a lawyer is fun. So I'm curious to see how the legislature deals with it.
I know we were supposed to finish at 5 today. I wonder if you've got time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, we're good. Right, Laura?
I gotta get you out of here by 5:15.
Okay. Back of the room. Yes.
Okay. So at times like these, it's easy to feel like we have very little control over what is happening politically. How would you recommend average citizen get more politically involved or like civically involved?
My number one piece of advice for young and old alike is, or my number one perspective is, I think we pay far too much attention to Washington, D.C. It's understandable why we do. You know, the president's got big sweeping power. This current president is making big sweeping changes. But I think for the most part, 90% of what you care about, what I care about, what we think about is not happening in Washington, D.C. It's happening in your state capital or in your county and city level. And I was the same way before I worked for Governor Inslee. Like I was very focused on D.C. and at the time what was happening with President Obama. And then I got down to Olympia and I was just blown away by how tangible and real and relevant everything down there was. Anybody know how many bills are passed in Olympia every year, roughly? 100? About 400, roughly. About 400 bills are going to be passed in Olympia every year. Some are very small, technical fixes, changing language, changing things, but hundreds of bills are going to be passed in Olympia this session that impact your lives. On your taxes, on your public safety, on the quality of your roads, on fire prevention, on environmental safeguards, so many things. And for the most part, most of us can't name our state representative. And I was the same way before I worked in Olympia. I'm not casting aspersions on anyone. But we get so focused on the presidency and DC and Congress. Congress doesn't do jack these days. The president does. So I would just encourage you to direct your attention and your advocacy to your city council, to your county council, and to your state capital. If one thing that maybe has changed for me in these recent weeks, for a long time, I was a big advocate of a strong executive branch. Now that feels less comfortable. But I do think, states in recent years are showing, again, that we are the laboratory for democracy, right? We were one of the first states in the country to legalize gay marriage. We were one of the first states in the country to legalize the use of marijuana, the recreational use, right? These are ways that we test new policy things. And I think we too often look to DC for guidance rather than leading and having these debates at a state level. So that would be my advice. Sir.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for being here. It means a great deal for you to take the time, which is, out of a very busy schedule, I'm sure. My name's Simon Smith. I'm an alumnus of WSU. My interest particularly is in climate change. Washington State has got a good record on making progress towards climate mitigation. And I was wondering how you're going to go about securing the progress that's been made, perhaps even pushing the envelope?
Well, a couple things. One, I think you're right. Washington State, not only in recent years, but for a long time, has been more at the cutting edge of this issues. And having been Governor Inslee's lawyer, I can know how important it was in the last 12 years. I would say two things. One, we need to continue to advance that good climate policy litigation or legislation. Laura can tell you a lot from the Department of Ecology perspective. From the AG's office perspective, we also need to make sure that we're implementing those laws well. And I'm really focused on that latter piece. Like it's one thing to pass a bunch of new laws. It's quite another thing to implement those laws effectively. And the state, frankly, I think is a little behind the ball on implementing some of those good policies. And the AG's office is responsible for developing a lot of the regulations and rulemaking and all that kind of thing. And we need to make sure that we're doing that work really well. And then in addition to that, I would love to continue to build and grow our environmental protection division, which did not exist 12 years ago. To AG Ferguson's credit, it created this new division. We've done more and more cases going after people harming the environment, which I would hope is a bipartisan approach, even though it often is not. So I would love to do more work in that space.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sir.
Thank you. I have a question on given the amount of attorneys who work in the office, I'm wondering how the caseload is divvied up. So are there some cases that take precedence over others?
Well, I would never say publicly that there are more important cases than others in my office. And the numbers don't matter as much. I don't know if there are lawyers in the room, but sometimes you can have one case and it's super big and complicated and hard versus having 10 cases that are sort of run of the mill and traditional. Obviously, the federal cases that we take on require a lot of intensive resources at a staff and paralegal level. But the vast majority of the cases that we're doing are the less sexy cases, right? We're defending the state on a myriad of tort cases. So when you sue the state of Washington, my office defends them. And some of those cases are mundane. If a state vehicle gets into a car accident, you sue the state of Washington, those are pretty run of the mill. We have hundreds of cases involving the Department of Children, Youth and Families for kids that are in care and custody that aren't getting good foster care services. We have a lot of cases involving how we treat people in our Department of Corrections. All those cases are important. And what I would say, just as a general matter, the cases that impact individuals directly are the cases to me that need the most of our attention. If we're being sued, it means there's an allegation of harm, often against an individual and often against somebody who's very vulnerable, someone in our care and custody, for example. Sir.
At what point would violation of the oath of office by an elected official, such as the president, serve as a tripwire by which an individual state, and through your office, sue the president?
Violation of the oath. I actually hadn't thought about that, in part because I guess what I would say is I'd have to think of the circumstance where the violation of the oath also directly impacts Washingtonians. There are people who think the president has already violated his oath. And it doesn't necessarily mean that Washington is the right state to involve in litigation. So at least for me, I'll be looking very closely as how do those violations impact Washingtonians? And I'm trying to think of a circumstance beyond what we've already done. I think, there's a lot of things that presidents do that people think is improper. Republican AGs were actively engaged in suing the Biden administration over things that they thought were improper. In my mind, there's been some very blatant disregard of the Constitution in the last month, which I would say is a violation of this oath. But I think you're speaking, say, maybe more broadly. So I would just have to look and see how it impacts Washingtonians.
I'm just wondering, since legal theories seem to be in vogue, that could be one that could be proposed and pursued.
I don't mind being creative.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking Nick Brown for a great talk.
I will endeavor to be back, hopefully as many times as my predecessor. And thank you all for showing up and participating. Sure. Bye.
You gotta run. Go for it.